Good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends of the Asser Institute. Welcome to the 8th Annual T.M.C. Asser Lecture, and a special welcome to Professor Fakhri, who will be addressing us in just a few minutes. I'm happy to welcome Professor Fakhri, who works at the University of Oregon Law School and is currently the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food. You are the 4th Special Rapporteur on the right to food, a position that was established by the United Nations in the year 2000, and you took office in 2020 when the Human Rights Council appointed you. Before becoming the Special Rapporteur on this subject, Professor Fakhri has been engaged in different capacities in legal issues relating to the right to food. You also wrote a book about sugar, I understand, and matters relating to development. The website of the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights gives a lot of information about your activities as Special Rapporteur and also tells us what your mandate is. And putting that information next to your CV demonstrates that you must be the right person to deal with issues relating to the right to food at the UN level at this point in time. As is well known, the law is not silent on the right to food. The right to food is protected in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's Article 25, and in the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in Article 11, supported by General Comment number 12. These are provisions that are most often mentioned, but if one looks in greater detail, many more norms are relevant, such as rules to be found, for instance, in the Women's Convention with respect to access to agricultural credit. Regional human rights instruments also refer to the importance of protecting on an equal basis access to food, to the possibility to produce food and to have access to a fair market to sell such produce. International humanitarian law, the law that protects the position of individuals in times of armed conflict, contains many rules specific to ensuring that the population has access to sufficient food supplies during armed conflict. And the same goes for obligations of the occupying power to ensure the supply of food to the population in occupied territory, or the detaining power having similar obligations with respect to prisoners of war. There are many norms to rely on, yet the establishment of the position of Special Rapporteur suggests that, in spite of all the norms, the implementation may not be successful or sufficient, as many people still lack access to sufficient quality food. You are the Special Rapporteur at a difficult point in time. The world is facing lots of conflicts. Some of them are in the media every day, and others do not receive as much attention as they should to attract international activism. Thus, the perception of problems related to food may differ depending on the news people have access to, or problems connected to conflicts may become exaggerated as our perception is influenced by the reporting in the media. For example, quickly after the beginning of the Russian attack on Ukraine, trouble arose with respect to the supply of sunflower cooking oil in Dutch supermarkets. No sunflower oil was available for a few months, but I would add that other types of cooking oil remained available. Now I think today the sunflower oil is supplied again from somewhere else and it has returned to supermarket shelves. Is this a question related to the right to food? No, probably not. but it was in the news for some time in spite of other situations of scarcity of food elsewhere that did not attract the attention of the Dutch public. Our perception of problems related to access to food may become distorted by the way in which the media portray them. Professor Fakhri, you will be speaking to us today about the right to food, violence and food systems. We are happy that you have invited our invitation to speak at this 8th annual ASSER lecture on these important issues. It is not only a matter of interest to the large number of friends and supporters of the T.M.C. ASSER Institute, but the theme of your address brought us also a possibility to reach out to a community that is specifically interested in food and agriculture and issues related to the right to food. We hope that this may lead to many more contacts between the issues and these experts. As they would say in agriculture, cross-pollination of these types of expertise. We are looking forward to that. Now, with the annual lecture, the ASSER Institute celebrates the life and role of Professor T.M.C. ASSER, who was an eminent legal scholar and so far is the only Dutchman ever to have received the Nobel Peace Prize. We are proud that the ASSER Institute bears his name, and it is a privilege to annually invite renowned international experts to speak about issues at the crossroads of international developments and international law, the domain in which the ASSER Institute operates. So far, we have organized 7 annual lectures on a broad variety of themes addressing international issues related to law and society. The speakers at the annual ASSER lecture have each of them provided us with food for thought and have contributed to further reflection. The publication of last year's lecture by Professor Bridget Lafan about the European Union and the conflict in Ukraine is just out, and it is available in the hall in this building. Reflection about law, international law, European law, as well as private international law, and society is at the heart of the work of the ASSER Institute. Recently, we have established our strategic research agenda for the 2022-2026 period, entitled Rethinking Public Interest in International and European Law. And I invite you to have a look at this broad program, which describes expert legal research on specific developments in the international legal system that we are planning to undertake. This agenda is to be found on our website. Professor Fakhri, you have recently given an interview to Caroline de Ruiter of the Dutch newspaper NRC Handelsblad, which appeared last Tuesday. It was a good introduction to the issues you will be addressing this afternoon, I suspect. What I personally liked about the interview was your message that cynicism is not the way forward when we look at the right to food, particularly in relation to conflict. That is an important message which I understood to be underlying your work as Special Rapporteur on the right to food. I'm looking forward to your presentation, but before that I would like to give the floor to Mr. Wim Jansen, who represents the municipality of The Hague, where he is the Director of International Affairs. The municipality has been co-sponsoring the annual lectures for a long time, and we are very grateful for their support. So I'm happy to pass the floor to Mr. Jansen for a few words of welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisbeth. Friends of the City of The Hague, Professor, Excellencies, I'm honored to welcome all of you on behalf of the City of The Hague. And I'm happy and proud that we are able to give you a platform, and give a platform to those who work with us to advance international peace and justice. Now, usually I attend this meeting sitting among you in the public, listening to my mayor, welcoming you, reading a speech that me and my colleagues then would have written. But this year I'm on stage, but I sincerely have to apologize, my mayor. He would have loved to be here. But sometimes politics get priority and he has to be in council today. I am very proud of the different organizations we harbor in this international city of justice and peace. What we call this ecosystem of peace and justice. It consists of 5 types of institutions. And they all work towards a more just and peaceful world. Most surprisingly, probably for this kind of audience, is private businesses. But we have many of them working under the shared motto, doing good and doing business, or also Impact City, working actually also towards a better and just world. We have a lot of international organizations, like the UN institutions are established in the Peace Palace behind us. We have non-governmental organizations, of which many are represented here today. We have government, ministries, as well as local government, obviously. And last but not least, knowledge institutes, like the ASSER Institute. They all lay the groundwork for making the world a more just and safer place. And I mentioned the ASSER Institute as an important one. You should not under-evaluate and undervalue the impact of research and critical and constructive reflection in the development of peace and justice. Certainly not in today's times, where disinformation is a much-used tool to undermine peace. And we are happy to count the ASSER Institute among our major parties of our ecosystem. And obviously, we are happy to contribute to a meeting like this one. That makes me think of today's topic, right to food. It's a topic tied closely with the topics of justice and peace. I think shortages of food can be the consequence as well as the cause for conflicts. And the Ukraine conflict shows this. Kremlin's disinformation, we think, seeks to convince global audiences that international sanctions imposed on Russia are to blame for the surge in food and fuel prices. In reality, we think it's Russia's invasion of Ukraine that destabilizes global food markets, which could cause a global food crisis that lasts 20 years, as the UN has alarmed us. Now, reflecting on that, I'm very interested to hear from our esteemed speaker, Professor Fakhri, how we could break that cycle of conflict and food insecurity. And I think it fits very well into the programs that we run in this city of peace and justice. At the same time, like I mentioned, it's not the international organizations and governments alone who are drivers for change. I think NGOs like Mercy Corps, HIVOS, Oxfam Novib work with local communities on access to land, access to water, invest in climate resilience to tackle food insecurity. And they all work in this city. NGOs offer essential services to our societies and pressure governments about their obligations and help them make laws and policies that serve everyone. Now, while talking about holding governments responsible, I note the passing of Benjamin Ferencz, the last surviving Nuremberg prosecutor, last week. Ferencz assisted in laying the foundation for the International Criminal Court, another landmark building of peace and justice in The Hague. It's often confused with this one, though it's not a palace. As a closing note, I want to remind you again of his life's motto. Just outside, there's a path along the fence named after him, and his motto is rule of force. Replace rule of force with the rule of law. And you'll find a bench with his famous expression, law, not war, outside of this building. I hope the city of The Hague inspires you to work towards that same goal.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome once again. My name is Leon Castellanos-Jankowicz, and I'm a researcher at the ASSER Institute for International and European Law, where I work on public international law and human rights. I'm here to ease us all into our conversation with our very special guest today. And before I do that, I would just like to highlight on behalf of us researchers at the Institute how privileged we feel and are to be hosting such a discussion here with you today. As Professor Leinzat has already mentioned in her opening speech and welcome, it is crucial for us to have spaces that enable us to come together in dialogue and frank discussion. And not only is our speaker today able to do this with unmatched expertise, ladies and gentlemen, we're in for a treat. Because our speaker is one of the few scholars in the world on his subject who is not afraid to speak truth to power in a way that is reflective and thoughtful, but also incisive and rigorous. And with that, Michael, I would like to welcome you. You have the floor.
Thank you. That was very generous. Thank you, Neil. That's good. My goodness, let's manage your expectations. Just gonna have a conversation. Thank you, everyone. Whoops. You know, ever since the pandemic, I've come to really appreciate and value gatherings like this, these public gatherings. I'm still not sure how to talk about the COVID-19 pandemic. Do we talk about it in the past tense? People still get sick from the virus. People still die from COVID-19. And many people are still vulnerable. And while the effects of the virus may have diminished, the profound inequality that was made worse during the pandemic is going to last years, if not decades to come. Moreover, everyone's still very tired. Everyone is carrying more sorrow, more pain, and more anger. So thank you. Thank you for being here, for coming tonight. I think when we gather in large numbers like this, it's important to treat them as moments of connection and change. I also want to thank the number of people that made this lecture possible. I'm grateful to the Asser Institute and the municipality of The Hague for hosting this event. And from the Asser Institute, I'm very grateful to Eva da Costa and her team. They've been fantastic to work with in making this possible. A big thank you to my spouse, Lisa Romano, and my young son for making it possible for me to be here today. And you know, between my UN duties, my obligations at the university, and my parental duties, trips like this are very hard for me. I don't travel often like this. And it requires high-level negotiations with my spouse and my 7-year-old. And of course, the prestige of the Asser Lecture and the setting of the Peace Palace is remarkable. I'm truly honored to be here, you know, especially since some of my favorite teachers and mentors were previous speakers in this series. So right before I left home, my son asked me, is the Peace Palace really a palace? I said, yes, of course, yes, it is. And then he asked me, since it's a peace palace, does that mean that no one is allowed to bring in weapons? I told him, yeah, that's right. It's a place where everyone leaves their weapons at home and where enemies come and they agree not to fight. A sanctuary of sorts. I mean, we all went through security. And when talking to a 7-year-old, it's important not to be cynical. And I always try to be truthful when answering my son's questions, no matter what he asks. So I had to pause when he asked me, what made it a peace palace and not a war palace? I told him, well, it's a peace palace because it's where countries come to use their words and imagination to work things out. So sure, this all sounds lovely, huh? But to be honest, in the grind of daily life, the honor of this lecture and this space carries very little leverage in the domestic negotiation. What allowed me to win the domestic negotiations and to travel here today was the fact that friendship was at stake. I would not be here today if not for Jeff Gordon from the Asser Institute. I'm lucky enough to be able to dedicate more and more of my time working with friends. And Jeff is a friend whom I don't see that often, but when I do see him, it's lovely. I'm here today to talk about the right to food, violence, and food systems. I'm drawing from my work as UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food. As a UN Special Rapporteur, I'm an independent expert selected by the Human Rights Council. My job is to act as the eyes, ears, and good conscience for the UN system on all matters regarding hunger, malnutrition, and famine from a human rights perspective. It's my job to talk to and to learn from everyone I talk with governments, social movements, activists, businesses, journalists, researchers, students, and international civil servants. And part of my duties includes advising governments and international organizations. I brief the Human Rights Council, the General Assembly, the Security Council, and I've met with scores of international organizations. But at the heart of how I understand my duties, I think my job is to provide a practical interpretation of the right to food that serves everyone. But of course, today I'm speaking to you in my personal capacity. I want to use this as an opportunity to reflect on my work, to share what I've learned, and to learn with you in this public setting. My plan tonight is to first briefly explain what the right to food means to me. Second, I will explain the particular problems I've encountered in my work and what I've learned from the pandemic. Here, I'll explain why I chose the issue of violence as my topic for my report that I presented to the General Assembly several months ago. Third, I will outline and frame the problem of hunger, malnutrition, and famine. And I identify different forms of violence and the conditions that enable those forms of violence. And finally, I will conclude by pointing in the direction of which we could all go towards, showing what other world is actually possible, what other world we could make together by salvaging what we have today. Much of my talk today will be an exercise in critical description and institutional tactics. What I mean by that is I will share with you what theoretical lessons I've learned from navigating the social and institutional spaces of the food crisis on a global scale. There is a lot at stake in how you frame an issue. How you frame something determines what future is possible and visible. And so my main intervention is to frame the main problem in food systems today as a matter of violence. And it's kind of odd today to talk about violence when my focus is food. As a researcher, I first decided to focus on food because its role in everyday life. Food to me is first and foremost about pleasure. If you haven't noticed the bouquet, it's beautiful. There's red peppers, there's cauliflower, there's broccoli. This is how we think about food. The pleasure of eating with others. In fact, in some ways, it's also a little odd for me to be before you today to talk about human rights. I come from a tradition that's very cautious about law's emancipatory potential. More particularly, I come from a tradition of international law that has been very suspicious of human rights law. This tradition, third world approaches to international law, you can call it TWAIL, is actually wary of all of international law. This is because of empirical reasons. International law has been and continues to be a part of imperial adventures. International law has been and continues to be a constituting feature of capitalism. And in turn, imperialism and capitalism, in all their intertwining forms, continue to be central to international law. But TWAIL doesn't abandon international law just yet, because that would cede too much ground too quickly. In TWAIL, we maintain a critical stance in relation to international law, and we always look for tactical opportunities for resistance and for salvage. What inspired me to be a UN Special Rapporteur was the food sovereignty movement. This is a movement, a social movement that began in the mid-1990s. It was started by peasants primarily from Latin America and from Europe. It quickly expanded globally and also drew in fishers, pastoralists, indigenous peoples. This movement is what gave and gives the right to food its radical power. And then you have the trade unions representing food and agricultural workers. They brought their own popular power into the right to food. And with them, they brought international labor law. This combination of peasants, fishers, pastoralists, indigenous peoples, and workers makes the right to food an opportunity for all these social movements to come together in solidarity on a global scale and potentially change food systems all over the world. Governments can't figure it out, but people have. So I don't believe in international law necessarily as a force of good as such. It's a force, like other forces, that can be wielded in all sorts of different ways, good and bad and useless and useful. What I believe in is people's ability to organize themselves and express their popular power. I believe in people's ability to use their power to make the world, despite profound degrees of oppression, exploitation, and inequality. What I have seen during the pandemic is that despite the anguish, despite the high rates of sickness and death, people survived. And they expressed their right to food when they organized themselves and took care of each other. They deployed the right to food when they pushed their governments to meet their demands for access to good food. And they deployed the right to food when they pushed against corporate interests. What I learned from the food sovereignty movement is that people have been fighting for decades to regain power in their own food systems. They're trying to regain it from transnational corporations and those that serve corporate interests. What I've also learned from the food sovereignty movement is that if you change the food system, you change everything. So what does the right to food mean? So let's not start with talk of violations and victims, of hunger and famine, of bad guys doing criminal things, or good guys coming in to save the day. Let's start with how we actually eat food. The right to food is the right for everyone to celebrate life through their meals with each other in communion. Drawing from the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the right to food is everyone's right to be free from hunger, malnutrition, and famine. Something to keep in mind is that for the past 60 years, if not several hundred years, hunger and famine are always caused by political forces using food as a weapon or institutional failure due to negligence. The problem of hunger, malnutrition, and famine is always a political problem and not a matter of scarcity as such. That means it's not a fantasy to call for the elimination of hunger. To call for universal freedom from hunger is a political agenda. Moreover, it is an existential agenda. Food is a key way that people define their very understanding of community. Food is also central to how people establish their relationship with the land and with waterways. Food is therefore an inherent way that people produce their culture. With this in mind, it is helpful to think of human rights as part of a political and cultural agenda. So what I've just described to you is an understanding of the right to food that draws not just from the normative, doctrinal meaning of the right to food. I presented to you an understanding of the right to food that made sense to me in the midst of the pandemic, in the midst of a food crisis. It is an understanding of the right to food that has enabled me to engage with a wide range of people and communities in a moment of great need. So what's the actual problem? Yes, we're in a food crisis, and we can frame that problem in a lot of different ways. In very general terms, the rate of hunger and malnutrition has been on the rise since 2015. The pandemic made existing problems worse because of lockdowns, because of workers' health and safety not being adequately addressed, because migrant workers and rural communities were dehumanized. We had so-called supply chain disruptions. Because people couldn't go to work or go to the shops or visit each other, people could not access food. No country, rich or poor, has escaped the food crisis. Moreover, all this is against the backdrop of a climate change crisis and now a cost of living crisis. And because of the pandemic, almost every country is experiencing a debt crisis. And I was just reading about the Dutch nitrogen crisis. Crisis, crisis, crisis. Many activists and scholars will frame things as a crisis in order to spur change. The theory being that if only people and governments knew the truth and the urgency of the matter, they will act and they will take action. Well, people know. We all know how bad things are. In the newspaper, I was quoted as saying the world is shit. Oh dear. And it got translated into Dutch, huh? We don't need anyone to tell us. If you're so privileged and you are still unaware or surprised by how profoundly bad things are, then you're part of the problem. All this talk of crisis can leave you feeling powerless. Thinking in terms of crisis also often leads to reactive, superficial, and ahistorical analysis. Those with institutional power will always try and use a crisis as an opportunity to increase their power, shrouding themselves in the false cloak of helpfulness. Despite all the talk of crisis and institutional hand-wringing, in the midst of the pandemic and in the midst of the current food crisis, people mobilized. When governments were unable to ensure that people had access to good food, neighbors, families, and communities took it upon themselves to work together to feed each other. When you're hungry, you don't wait for someone to feed you. As part of my duties as UN Special Rapporteur, in the midst of the pandemic and lockdown, I organized a series of online consultations with communities from a wide range of regions representing different constituencies. And luckily, I had several comrades to help. And we called these consultations Right to Food conversations. In the end, I think it was like 15 to 18 hours of different consultations. So I had the help of Nadia Lambeck, Dina Suvala, Tommaso Ferrando, Emily Cunningham, and Nick Kamen. During the Right to Food conversations, I rarely heard things framed as a crisis as such. Yes, we were in the midst of a pandemic and struggling, but people focused on explaining their problems and how they were dealing with those problems. People also knew what they needed to get past those problems in the immediate and in the long term. So if our working assumption is that all people are equal in dignity and in rights, and if we think that people have the power to determine their path in life, then when we witness situations of profound inequality, we have to ask ourselves, what created this inequality? How are people made poor, vulnerable, or marginalized? How is inequality produced? Structural inequality is not a natural occurrence or anomalous. It is produced by systems, including food systems. What happens is that when food providers are vulnerable or weak, that's what makes communities vulnerable and weak. In other words, when caregivers, workers, peasants, fishers, pastoralists go hungry, we all go hungry. To go back to these Right to Food conversations. So in those many hours of conversations with communities from around the world, I was very focused on facilitating these conversations. I was listening to people in an effort to make everyone feel welcome in order to create a space of testimony and solidarity. But what did it all mean, all of this testimony? So my comrades and I were debriefing, we're trying to figure out what did we learn, what happened, what did we just do here? It was Dina Suvala who pointed out the incredible amount of violence that people were describing. And as soon as she said that, it was this immediate moment of clarity. And that led me to find the research that I needed. This took me to the work of people like Hilary Charlesworth, Susan Marks, Julia Dem, Usha Natarajan, Tendai Achume, Anna Lacamia, and Eliana Cusato. This is why my last report to the UN General Assembly and my talk today is framed in terms of violence. And I should add that my understanding on systemic violence in food systems comes from working closely in collaboration with Liz Kulamendayel. So here's what I learned from my Right to Food conversations with communities and working with comrades. I learned 3 theoretical points that I'll share with you. The first point that I'll share is that structural inequality has made mass amounts of people more vulnerable to violence. In turn, systemic violence has been a significant cause of structural inequality. So, in terms of analysis, the first place to start is to focus on this vicious cycle of structural inequality and systemic violence. The second thing to take into consideration is that human rights are limited when you see everything in terms of identifying a victim and finding a violation. It's analytically limited because you'll miss the root causes of the problem. More importantly, this focus on violations and victims is politically problematic. Primarily focusing on violations and victims puts the power in the hands of the human rights expert. Rarely does one want to experience life as a victim because it implies that you are an object and something was done to you. People who experience profound degrees of harm and violence rarely describe themselves as victims. They often describe themselves as survivors. Everyone here today and everyone watching this lecture is a survivor of systemic violence. We have all survived a pandemic. No one is a victim. We are all survivors. And by that sheer fact that we are still alive, we have power. So the political task is not about empowering others. It is about how do we recognize, share, and organize the power that we already possess. The third thing that I learned was that the dead also have power. Our kin, family, and friends that have died give us our sense of tradition, dignity, and justice. However, we must be open and fearless enough to always keep learning new meanings of tradition, dignity, and justice from those that have died. Having introduced what the right to food means to me and what theoretical and political lessons I've learned, let me now turn to explaining how food systems produce violence. Generally, I'm trying to understand how violence is a force of change. To me, change arises by forming new relationships or when existing relationships themselves change. Therefore, when thinking about how violence is a force of change, I want to think about it in terms of how violence creates or changes relationships. When I'm looking at violence, I'm looking for a type of harm that reverberates through people's web of relationships. For the most part, I focus on how violence damages an individual's relationship with their history, with the land, and with their community. In my reading and research, I often look for how people resist violence. But to understand resiliency, as we experienced and witnessed during the pandemic, I think I have a lot more to learn about how people respond to violence by also deepening their relationship with history, land, and community. What I mean by systemic violence is that it's the result of human choices and it's not natural or unavoidable. Many food systems rely on violence to exist. People have built food systems that allow them to regularly benefit from oppressing and exploiting other people. And as a result, food systems not only produce food, but also amplify and produce violence that makes people more poor and marginalized. It's also important to keep in mind that violence is prevalent in food systems both in times of peace and war. International humanitarian law makes a distinction between armed conflict and peacetime, but from a food systems perspective, that distinction is not always helpful. Sometimes people have better access to food during wartime than they do during peacetime. This was true in some places in Europe during World War II compared to the 1950s. And this is true in my country, in Lebanon. People had better access to food during this 15-year civil war than they do today, right now in Lebanon. What I have done in my report to the General Assembly is taken all the instances of violence in food systems that I heard about and that I studied, and I grouped them together in different forms of violence. This allows me to better understand how different manifestations of violence are interconnected. It also enables me to better understand how food systems are both structured by and produce violence. I'm not able yet to provide an account of how it's all interconnected. That's sort of into the future. However, I do start with identifying forms of violence in order to show how different instances of violence are more similar than they may appear at first blush. So, the 4 forms of violence that I conceptualize are the following. Number 1, discrimination. Number 2, bodily harm or assault against a person's physical and mental integrity. Number 3, ecological violence. And number 4, erasure. It's important to think of these 4 forms of violence as interconnected and overlapping. This is not the only way to conceptualize violence. It's not an exhaustive list. The point is to provide a narrative on how different interests and identities are experiencing shared forms of violence to enable an intersectional analysis. And I will detail a bit more what each of these forms of violence mean. And then I'll explain the conditions that enable this violence. And as a preview on those conditions, I'll explain how systemic violence and structural inequality in food systems are a central feature of a global economy that is supported by relationships of dependence amongst individuals, countries, international financial institutions, and corporations. And this same economy also relies on extractive practices that disrupt people's social and ecological relationships, and it denigrates human and environmental health. So it's a story of 4 forms of violence that arise out of relationships of dependency and extraction. So let me begin with the first one, discrimination. By framing discrimination as a form of systemic violence, this allows me to understand how inequality is created by oppressing people because of their identity. One significant way that human rights tries to ensure that all human beings are free and equal in dignity and rights is by prohibiting discrimination based on a person's identity, lack of wealth, or legal status. The most common way that inequality is produced in food systems is by denying or impeding people's access to food, also by denying people's access to the means and entitlements necessary for the procurement of food. Discrimination by denying people's access to food is always an instance of violence. It causes individual harm because by denying access to food, you are exposing a person to a high risk for hunger and malnutrition. That denial also disrupts people's social and ecological relationship in long-lasting ways. Instances of discrimination are usually part of a pattern of systemic violence because it's usually based on widely held assumptions regarding ability, class, legal status, age, gender, race, and other identities. Discrimination as a form of systemic violence stems from a constructed abstract notion of what is normal and then targets whomever doesn't fit that particular definition of normal. It often stems from an assumption that certain people are less worthy because of certain traits or their identity. So again, discrimination shows how we all have a wide range of different identities, and our access to food is determined by the different degrees of privilege and oppression that operate through the intersection of all these identities. The second form of violence is bodily harm. So bodily harm or assault against a person's physical and mental integrity. Bodily harm is the most tangible form of violence in food systems. And what I want to do here is understand how violence operates at different scales in food systems. So I looked at different contexts in which food systems systemically produce bodily harm. These are things like malnutrition, famine, sexual and gender-based violence, unilateral coercive measures, which is things like embargoes and sanctions, and of course, armed conflict. I was inspired by a lot of feminist work from past decades to group all of these instances as the same type of, same form of violence. What all these instances of violence share is that they are primarily driven by a desire for domination, to weaken others by forcing them to submit. This makes me think that what connects famine, gender-based violence, sanctions, armed conflict, is some element of patriarchy. But I do need to think a lot more about that. It's an intuition that I want to delve into more deeply. Violence causing bodily harm does not only include direct harm, but it also includes the denial of access to food by destroying infrastructure or crippling an economic system. Whether it's sanctions or bombs, the result is the same. This form of violence is about more than just hurting or killing. Bodily harm includes creating a climate of fear that denigrates individuals, communities, and peoples and makes them vulnerable to exploitation. The third form of violence is ecological violence. industrial food systems have had a massive environmental impact. Food systems emit approximately 1/3 of the world's greenhouse gases. Moreover, because of climate change, biodiversity is decreasing due to pollution, ecological destruction, deforestation, and the removal of protective ecological barriers. Around 1 million animal and plant species are now threatened with extinction, many within decades. What has driven much of this damage has been industrial-intensive agriculture and export-oriented food policies. It is common to frame the problem as a technical matter, a lack of effective environmental policies that require the careful management and use of natural resources. But what's happening is that food systems are ripping apart people's relationship with the environment, leading them to dissociate from and destroy the very same ecosystem that is necessary for life. Recognizing this dynamic as ecological violence highlights the fact that one cannot separate environmental harm from human harm. Too often, people want to protect the environment and don't think about the people that are an inherent part of that particular ecosystem. So in many ways, conceptualizing ecological violence as a right to food issue highlights the political agenda for agricultural transformation. Here's an outline of what that political agenda for agricultural transformation looks like when you're thinking in terms of ecological violence. Some describe ecological violence caused by climate change as slow violence. The idea being that much of the harm and death it causes is not instantaneous or spectacular, but incremental and invisible. Of course, there are these moments of literal flare-up. We had wildfires where I live in the West Coast in the United States. The historical debate then that we have to have is this process, did it begin with the Industrial Revolution, or did it begin with the advent of agriculture itself? The concept of ecological violence means that we need to understand the fact that when land and environmental defenders are threatened, attacked, and killed, this is meant to instill fear into the heart of community. We're seeing a rising rate of human rights activists, land defenders, and environmental defenders being killed. Threatening, attacking, and killing these environmental defenders, these land defenders, these water defenders, is meant to stop communities from defending their own territory, and therefore should be understood as acts of terror and assassination. Focusing on ecological violence also highlights the importance of land rights. I don't mean private property. What I mean by land rights are people's informal and formal systems of land tenure that they create to ensure a stable, long-standing relationship with the land. Framing instances of environmental harm as ecological violence in the context of the right to food highlights the importance of making sure that farmers and indigenous peoples can freely save, use, exchange, and sell seeds. Seeds are life. Pushing against turning seeds and genetic material into private property, the commodification of life itself. It also highlights the importance of talking about agrarian reform and the redistribution of land. And the fourth and final form of violence is erasure, to erase people, to make them invisible. Erasure can refer to the practice of collective indifference that renders certain people and groups invisible. It arises from the narratives that are set and are produced by political agenda, raising the questions of whose stories are taught and told and by whom, whose knowledge and experience is prioritized, whose struggle is recognized and whose struggle is ignored, and whose dead are mourned. What is at stake is dispossession and occupation is not only ecological violence and land rights, but dispossession and occupation of land can also undermine people's very existence and sense of being. Colonial settlers around the world have dispossessed indigenous peoples from their territory through international law, using doctrines of terra nullius or doctrines of discovery. This is exemplified, for example, by the well-known Zionist phrase, a land without a people for a people without a land, which was used to try and render the Palestinian people invisible. But they're very visible and they're very here. Gradual and immediate erasure occurs when communities are dispossessed from their ancestral land by land grabs or occupation, leaving them displaced, dispersed, and sometimes forgotten. This has turned many a biodiverse region into spaces of resource extraction and export dependency, rife with local hunger and malnutrition. I'll give you some examples. In Mexico, indigenous communities have been dispossessed and displaced through land grabs. What I mean by land grabs is when often it's investors and corporations come in and buy up huge amounts of land and concentrates it. These land grabs were enabled through and encouraged, incentivized through free trade agreements and neoliberal agricultural policies. These policies have not only deprived these communities in Mexico of their livelihood, but also of their very identity, especially when they had to migrate to urban areas, and that in turn aggravated urban poverty and led to further violence. Another example is in India, the Polavaram Dam project has had devastating impacts on rural communities, with an estimated 70,000 people expected to lose their livelihood entirely or partially, sinking the community underwater, their land underwater. In Guatemala, Mayan, Garifuna, and Xinca peoples have been excluded and marginalized at the expense of local businesses, transnational corporations in the sectors of hydroelectricity and extractive industries like monoculture farming and mining. Now, indigenous peoples have a very powerful legal tool to protect their land and lives from violence, and this is the principle of free, prior, and informed consent. This is the right of indigenous peoples to either give or withhold their consent from any action that would affect their lands, territories, or rights. Non-indigenous communities in rural areas also have a legal tool. This is from the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and other people working in rural areas, known as UNDROP. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and other people working in rural areas provides that states shall consult and cooperate in good faith with peasants, ensuring active, free, effective, meaningful, and informed participation of individuals and groups in associated decision-making processes while taking into consideration power imbalances. These are examples where sometimes international law is a good thing, despite my skepticism. So I'll turn now to the conditions that enable this violence that I've described to you. We do need a drink, after that. It's a good thing there's a reception. Countries and transnational corporations, in the pursuit of extracting resources from nature, have disrupted and reconfigured people's social and ecological relationships. This relational disruption means that corporations and countries are limiting people's ability to have a stable livelihood, and it attacks people's very existence. This degree of disruption and reconfiguration is a violent act against people, undermining their dignity and humanity, often through categories of disability, race, and gender. The resulting structural inequality is illustrated by the fact that people in situations of vulnerability and from marginalized communities are usually and predictably at the losing end of having their rights met, especially the right to food. I keep saying the same groups: women, indigenous peoples, workers. Why is this predictable? It's because it's structural, it's systemic. Systemic violence limits or denies people access to the necessities of life: land, seeds, water, fair and stable markets, and dignified work. When people are dispossessed of their land or work in hostile conditions, they're more exposed to harm on a regular basis. So when you don't have secure access to land or dignified work, you lose your bargaining power. You have less bargaining power because you're limited in your ability to negotiate favorable terms in a commercial transaction or when you're negotiating the conditions of your job. This is how systemic violence makes people vulnerable and dependent, while enabling a relatively small group to take advantage of others' vulnerability. It allows the few who already have power and resources to gain the ability to restrict access to what is necessary to reproduce life generating more violence and inequality. In other words, what makes the rich powerful is that they act as gatekeepers to the necessities of life. During today's food crisis, transnational corporations in the agri-food sector are profiteering while people struggle and suffer and as life gets harder. During the pandemic, the wealth of food sector billionaires increased by $1 billion with a B, $1 billion every 2 days. In 2021, Cargill, one of the world's largest food traders, made $5 billion in net income, the biggest profit in its 156-year history, with even higher gains expected this year. Markets today amplify the crisis and are prone to volatility because we have a global food system which relies on a small number of industrial-produced staple grains, a small number of countries to produce those grains for export, and a small number of corporations who dominate the agri-food sector. Starting in the 1980s till today, the dominant global common sense was that governments should no longer use international agricultural law and policy to cooperate, nor should governments use international law and policy to try and stabilize markets. Instead, from the early 80s until now, policymakers were driven by short-term calculations of rapid production and maximizing profit. So I'll briefly highlight how food systems that produce violence rely on relationships of dependency and extraction. So the dependency relationships go like this. Importing countries depend on global markets for food. When the war in Ukraine happened, a country like Lebanon that depended on Ukraine suffered even more. Food exporting countries depend on global markets for capital. When the war started in Ukraine, who produced food not to feed its people, but to export, were weak. Workers depend on employers for their livelihood. Survivors of sexual and gender-based violence sometimes become more economically dependent on aggressors because of abuse. And people depend on the shrinking number of food commodities for their nourishment. We're eating a smaller and smaller variety of foodstuffs. Farmers increasingly depend on transnational corporations for their inputs, and developing countries depend on international financial institutions and rich countries for capital. Global food systems are characterized by extractivism, which can be understood as the non-reciprocal dominance-based relationship amongst human beings, non-human beings, and the land and water. Extractivist economies rely on the extraction and export of natural resources. Extractive industries are things like mineral and fossil fuel extraction, but it's also monoculture, large-scale agriculture, forestry, and fishery operations. And many development models rely on extractivism to generate economic growth. The theory is that the ecosystem is understood and imagined as a collection of commodities, and that ecological destruction is justified by economic growth. The assumption is that exploiting nature is worth it because the ensuing revenue will be shared and benefit the public at large. The reality is that extractivism leads to human impoverishment, especially at the expense of indigenous peoples, racialized communities, rural communities, small-scale food producers and peasants, and food and agricultural workers, and amongst that group, it's usually women. Extraction from nature and exploitation of people are inherently linked. You can't separate how you treat nature from how you treat people. You can't say, look at all this, we're going to be a green business and promote biodiversity, but we're going to exploit our workers. It doesn't work. From a right to food perspective, extractivism generates two problems. First, extractivist projects undermine and destroy traditional and small-scale hunting, fishing, herding, and agriculture, along with foraging and gardening practices that enhance biodiversity. Second, more and more food systems are becoming lethal because they limit biodiversity. By taking from the land and leaving nothing in return, we're left with barren soil. Soil depletion makes farmers more dependent on chemical inputs and high-energy processes, generating approximately 1/3 of the world's greenhouse gases. Trade law and investment law has enabled extractivist global food systems. Such food systems favor transnational and industrial food production practices, and they permit the enrichment of corporate actors at the expense of impoverishing rural communities all over the world. Global food systems also extract monetary value from the natural environment for global capital markets, leaving the environment degraded, depleted, and destroyed for centuries to come. Finally, global food production and supply chains are extractive because they take more than they give to workers and small-scale food producers, and they do this by underpaying them and exposing them to precarious and hazardous working conditions. In sum, the relationships of dependency and extraction are based on profound power imbalances and reaffirm structural inequality and create systemic violence. But let me conclude on what a healthy relationship looks like. Relationships based on reciprocity recognize the fact that we all share the same planet, and therefore we all share food systems. Reciprocal relationships build an economy that generates substantive equality. Reciprocal relationships also build an economy designed to encourage social cooperation and solidarity. I've witnessed during the pandemic how in times of crisis, relationships of dependency quickly break down, and relationships of resiliency, relationships of reciprocity stayed resilient. So let me end with a vision for the future. And this is a vision for a future that I see based on what I've witnessed today and in my work during the pandemic. It's a vision of the future based on practices and spaces happening right now all over the world, but it also draws from particular traditions and a long history. So I'll be concrete at first. I saw this future looking at schools during the pandemic. Many schools during the pandemic were granted extra resources by local and national governments to expand their mandate as institutions of care. Communities limited childhood hunger when they ensured that all children received good food, no questions asked. All a child had to do was show up and they would get a good meal in schools during the pandemic. And there were additional positive benefits that extended to families and communities, because when you alleviate hunger and malnutrition amongst children, when you feed children, you also reduce the rate of poverty. Some schools, like my own son's school district, what they did is they opened up their kitchens to the entire community and offered meals to anyone with a child who came to pick up food. So you drive up in your car, your kid in the back, and they just give you a boxed meal. No question, just because you were there, just because you're a member of the community. There's also a practice of using schools' public procurement programs as a force of change. Brazil did this. It started with their Zero Hunger program in 2003. And hunger and malnutrition were significantly reduced by making sure that schools purchased a good portion of their food from local small producers and indigenous farmers. So this not only granted children access to good food, it also provided local producers a stable market, a fair price. It connected local schools to local producers through a reciprocal relationship. I can imagine a version of school procurement that supports food producers in a way that also engages in agroecological practices, enhancing biodiversity. I can see a version of school procurement that also is committed to enforcing labor rights. So in this way, I hope you can see how universal school meals, combined with a particular kind of public procurement program, can have a transformative effect. Now, the bad news is now that the pandemic is ending, many governments are ending programs that we know worked to alleviate hunger, such as these universal school meals that I described to you. They know what worked, and yet they're ending these programs. In Brazil, when Bolsonaro took office in 2019, his administration dismantled the progressive procurement program. But I've been deeply inspired by the experience of enhancing schools' ability to be institutions of care and creating transformative relationships of reciprocity through procurement programs. So if I may end where I started with what I told my 7-year-old son, Let's use this space today, right here, right now, this gathering in the Peace Palace, as an opportunity to use our words and imagination to work things out. This is what I see in the future. Let's imagine for a moment. Let's imagine the moment of a meal as the moment in which we come together to eat, in which we celebrate life with each other, not just for holidays, every day, with every meal. And let's remember when we eat, every time we eat, how many people, how many strangers had to cooperate, and how many human and non-human relationships were involved to enable that delicious meal. That should be easy to imagine. We do have these moments. Now imagine if every day we kept working to eliminate violence in all its forms from these spaces. We're not going to end war as such. We're not going to eliminate all of violence everywhere. But imagine we're working and cooperating every day to carve out spaces to make sure, to make, share, and eat food. And every day we're making these spaces a place of sanctuary where everyone is safe and welcome. And we are working to expand these spaces of making and sharing and eating food and defending them from violence. These practices of making, sharing, and eating food and these spaces where life can flourish despite ongoing violence, these spaces can be palaces of peace, even if just for a moment. Thank you very much. Okay. So
Thank you so much, Michael. Please join me here on the stage
okay.
to continue our discussion. That was wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael, for ending on that note with an appeal to imagination, which sometimes we forget ourselves, but international lawyers actually do have and should have a lot of imagination. And I think it goes well, it chimes well with the rest of your talk when you talk about, root causes, what is the violence behind, how do we begin to understand the predicament in which we are today, but sometimes we have reminders of this imagination that we need to be more creative, and this talk is one of them. Curiously enough, we have another reminder in the building that you so often refer to today in the Peace Palace. If you look closely at the back facade, there is a frieze, front and center, right above the door, with an allegory to history. It says Historia in Latin. So our international lawyer ancestors presumably also had some imagination to think of history and what happens before us and what comes, of course, after us. So thank you so much for those reflections. I'm going to open now the floor for a discussion together with you. As usual, please introduce yourselves before asking your question. This is a question and answer session, so please, questions only. And introduce yourselves, please. There's 3 microphones around the room, and I will be asking my colleagues to move the mics. Let's see. We have one. Great. One question over here, and then I'll move around towards the room. Yes, please, in the front. Floris? Question here towards the front.
Thank you today for the lecture. My name is Shaki Bhatt. I am a student at the University of Leiden as well as a graduate of Arizona State University. My question is kind of what do you imagine justice and restitution looking like in the system, particularly around enabling indigenous communities and workers in this future food system?
Should I answer?
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, the place to start, I hope I don't sound trite, but the place to start is to ask indigenous peoples and workers, what do you want? I think often experts, lawyers, policymakers start with an answer, and they have a solution, and they have a policy paper, and they have a 6-point plan, and an infographic, and maybe even an app. And they'll forget to start with, how can I help you? There's that. And the second thing is to give indigenous peoples, workers, peasants more space in these institutional places. So I'll give you two specific examples. The Committee on World Food Security is based in Rome. It's called the CFS. This is the committee that where the world governments come together and use the right to food to try and develop negotiated policy tools and coordinate a response to problems. Price speculation, gender equality, agroecology. There's a formal mechanism for civil society and indigenous peoples where they organize themselves in an autonomous space. So what that means is they operate as their own political body, and indigenous peoples from all over the world, peasants from all over the world, pastoral, these constituencies, people representing themselves, not activist groups, not NGOs, they all have to figure out their own position because they have the power as a mechanism, as an autonomous mechanism, to negotiate with governments. So I've witnessed Sami reindeer herders from the Arctic with Palestinian peasants working together on a common policy, and then not everyone gets along. The workers always remind me, okay, peasants and family farms are great, but they're bosses too. And workers and small farmers don't get along. They have disputes, but this space of solidarity means then when they get to the negotiating table, it's a very powerful space. Another example is the Arctic Council has a space for indigenous peoples as well, where the indigenous peoples in the Arctic have more leverage than a non-Arctic government that might want to get involved. So we have these examples. This should be everywhere. This should be everywhere.
Thank you, Michael. Other questions?
Well, there's a lot.
Let's take two questions here in the front, please. The lady in the front and then the gentleman. We'll take them together.
Thank you so much, Professor Fakhri. It was wonderful food for thought. I was intrigued by your the inventory of 4 types of violence, and I wonder if there's also an intersectional element between some of them. And you sort of talked about the industrial food systems as part of the ecological violence, but I would also see a link to bodily harm. Mm-hmm. If you look at the food environments they are creating, there's a lot of impacts on bodies through the public health crisis, NCDs, diabetes, obesity. And I was wondering if you would also like to comment on that and give that some more thought for reflection.
Thank you. Next question, over in the front. Yes.
I'm Khalid Ahmed Chaudhry from International Human Rights Commission. Professor, thanks for hammering the conscience of international community, but they are still sleeping. They don't care whatever is happening in Global South. You also forgot mentioning invisibility of 10 million Kashmiris Indian occupied Kashmir, facing tyranny and all kind of miseries regarding food as well. Professor, there was a time after the Second World War, in Europe, people could see the citizens searching a piece of bread in garbage. Now this has been happening in Global South. May it be Africa, Latin America, Middle East, and Asia. So my question to you is, can't we suggest the richest countries and those countries who have the technology to provide that technology to promote agro-based industry and development of agriculture at modern style? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. 2 very important questions, Michael. Would you like to take those for now?
Yeah, thank you very much. So thank you both for those questions. So exactly, I really appreciate sort of highlighting, that's what my point is. They are intersectional and allows us to sharpen our analysis. So you're right, industrial agriculture causes ecological violence, it causes bodily harm in terms of the food it produces, and the food that we find that's cheap and available is harming us more than strengthening us. Also the workers in these industries, the way they're exploited, based just on usually it's migrant workers. So during the pandemic, the celebration of the essential worker and the food workers, what happened was they were essential workers, but they were treated as expendable. They were forced to work because they were essential without being provided adequate personal protective equipment. During the wildfires of where I live on the west coast of the United States in Oregon, workers were forced to work when we couldn't see the sun from the smoke of the wildfires. So industrial agriculture cuts across all those forms of violence. That's why I kept focusing on, they're the main problem. They have too much power. So we can start talking about how to limit corporate power. There's many tools available. There's the negotiation of a business and human rights treaty. We can use competition law, tax law, corporate law itself. But the other thing to remember about corporations is we don't need corporations to feed us. We feed each other. The rise of the corporate sector in food systems on a global scale is a relatively recent phenomenon. Starts bubbling in the 1960s and becomes global in the 1970s. Of course, he says in the Netherlands, corporations have existed since colonial times, right? And they've been part of food production, but not to the degree of infusing every aspect of our life to this level of power that is concentrated in their hands. So I would start with, if you're a corporation and you want to enter the food and agricultural sector, you need permission first. We're not going to assume you're allowed to do business in this space. Yes, we need business, and we need commerce, and we need trade. But you have to show, you have to do the work. Not you do business because everyone's allowed to do business, and then you make a mistake, and you do a little pamphlet that says corporate social responsibility and greenwashing, mea culpa. You need permission first. And thank you for, many communities from all over the world have been rendered invisible, and you've raised the one in Kashmir. But to your point about technology, I would say, I don't think the West or the global North or the former colonial powers knew how to use their own technology properly. I think the knowledge and technology we start with is the knowledge and technology that peasants, rural communities, indigenous peoples already have. But I think the power of the question is, but there needs to be a redistribution of wealth on a global scale. The rich countries got rich on the backs of the other countries. So there needs to be a moment of reckoning, I think, in that regard.
Thank you, Michael. Other questions? I see 2 questions here in the middle. First, the gentleman over there in the back. Could we give him a microphone? And then we'll come down a couple of rows below to the lady who is on that side. Thank you. Yes.
Sir, if you could stand.
I'm Wouter Vening. I'm with the Institute for Environmental Security, which is headquartered here in The Hague. Thank you for a very insightful lecture and your inspiring finale. I was, of course, very much impressed by your speaking on ecological violence. And you came close to the concept of ecocide. You didn't mention the word, and you know the debate which is at this moment ongoing. Would you be in favor of making ecocide a prosecutable crime with the International Criminal Court? Thank you.
Thank you. Fantastic question and very important these days. And let's just take that second one real quick over there, Michael. Just a couple rows ahead.
Hello, thank you very much for the lecture. My name is Anna Sikola. I'm a student at Leiden University. I really like the notion at the end, like it's a small scale example, like come down, go back to the community. But I do wonder, we are in this time where connection seems harder than ever, especially after COVID, although we're more connected than ever. So how to get back to community? So a very simple question. Thank you.
Thank you.
The simplest questions are usually the hardest ones, yeah. I mean, my immediate thought is, I don't know. So I'm going to start with ecocide to buy myself time. I can deal with ecocide more easily than connecting. So thank you. I know I've been following the debate about ecocide. I mean, what I'll say is this. I don't know which legal tool is going to be the one that helps. And I'm happy that there's more and more people thinking about the environment, not just as an environmental law problem. Maybe it's international criminal law, maybe it's corporate law, maybe it's whatever. So that's sort of my starting point. Personally, I'm not very invested in ecocide as a prosecutable crime within the international court for several reasons. But that's not to say I'm against, and I hope others sort of continue in that regard to see who gets to where we need to get to, great. But the reason is it starts first with my inherent wariness of using international criminal law through the court as it is. There are long, and it can be different. We could imagine the International Criminal Court being used differently. But up until now, it's been primarily focused on leaders in African countries. These are long-standing critiques, right? But also, criminal law itself focuses on the individual, and it's unclear whether prosecuting an individual through criminal law is powerful enough to address the systemic and structural issues. And third, that's on international criminal law. One more thing about international criminal law, we tend to prosecute the spectacular crimes, and it's the everyday violence that is the problem. And as I mentioned, ecological violence, a lot of it is slow violence. And by the time we get to that moment where we can have a violation and someone who caught it might be a little too late. And then the concept of ecocide, I worry that it might erase, it's about causing environmental harm, but we might then make certain people invisible, to go back to erasure. I worry, and I see this in conservation efforts, where people say, we want to preserve this space and call it wildlands, and create a park or a natural whatever, but every space on the planet, even Antarctica has researchers, so every space on the planet, there are people there. There are human beings there. And I know it's fashionable to say, don't be so anthropocentric. My response is, well, let's not forget humans. I see people who treat animals better than they treat humans. So ecocide has a danger, not because of, we can imagine it where it includes people, but ecocide has a danger of losing track of the people in these spaces and these environments. But I hope people continue thinking about this concept because, again, we are all thinking, I think, in similar ways, and it's a tactical question. On the question about connecting to the community, that's the question, truly. And I don't have an easy answer. And I appreciate that you caught what I was doing, which is I started something very specific, practical, and from my own personal experience as well. Because that's how we all start our day, I think, and that makes it less overwhelming. And I truly mean this, and I hope you see from how my presentation to how I'm answering. Invite people over to eat. Do you remember 2 years where we couldn't do that? It was miserable. It was miserable. So, sometimes people, because I deal with food, they'll say, how should I eat? Should I eat fair trade or vegan or whatever? I'm like, I don't care. But if it involves building relationships, if you call up your mom and you wanted a recipe, do that. Cook a dish that call your mom more often. That's the answer, to build those connections. So that question, I hope everyone carries that question with you tonight and goes home and keep thinking, how can I continue connecting more deeply with every part of what it takes to make, share, and eat food?
Thank you, Michael. I really resonate with your comment about, excessive focus on certain topics, especially when it comes to international lawyers, such as ecocide, but also egregious crimes like genocide, crimes against humanity. And, in my research on gun violence, 10% of gun deaths violent gun deaths, murders, occur in the context of the egregious crimes, right? Genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. 90% occur in law enforcement situations, right? As international lawyers, that's erasure. We don't really work on that, I'm trying to bring it to the table, but then people say, why do you focus on guns in Europe? Europe doesn't have a gun problem. Well, 6 of the top 10 major gun exporters are here in Europe. Yeah. And they're sending those guns to places that shouldn't be having those guns in the first place. 90% law enforcement situations we should be concerned about. So, wonderful to hear from you that, we need to shift the focus a little bit. Other questions? I think we still have time for a couple more rounds. Let's go over there in the back, the gentleman in the sweater, and then there's a young man down here.
International law can tackle corporations, well, total control, basically. And even if it can, are we in the position right now that the structural dependency that is so predominant all over the world can be reversed? Can we actually go back to more communal roots and communal production? Is it still possible?
Thank you. And then the young man who was in front of him, because...
My name is Sami Jabber, and I'm also a student at Leiden University. And in this context, I'm writing my thesis on the Lebanese financial crisis.
Allah يسعدك.
Something I've noticed is that the latter half of Article 11 of the ICSCR, which is the continuous improvement of living standards, is entirely ignored in literature. And I wonder what your perspective on the possibilities to utilize this existing rights would be for human rights.
Great questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Go for it. I mean, you're so lucky to have so many students in this audience today. We don't see that a lot.
And they're all from Leiden, so I'm like, I guess I need to hang out in Leiden. That's where all the cool kids are. The transnational corporation question. So, I identified some tools, but it's interesting, so in international law, I think one of the most powerful, sort of the most politically interesting and legally interesting discussions are happening in the negotiation over the Treaty on Transnational Corporations and Human Rights. That's ongoing right now. With all due respect to researchers who focus on corporate social responsibility, I think that's a dead end. I think time has proven that the UN guiding principles on human rights and like other similar tools, it's only getting worse, and these tools haven't worked. So international law, the treaty is an interesting place to start. Looking at trade law, looking at investment law. I mean, but what's also we're seeing is trade law and investment law are part of the problem. So we need to fundamentally transform international law itself to be able to engage or to hold corporations accountable. Some of the other tools I identified, though, aren't international as such, right? So corporate law itself, the fact corporations are legal entities, they're not real. They're not. Even though they're so powerful. The power that we created corporations, this is what the power of the corporations are. It's a way of limiting liability so individuals aren't held accountable. I am a shareholder. The corporation hires mercenaries to kill activists around an oil field. Shell. Hypothetically. Maybe it's the Ongani people, maybe. I'm a shareholder. The company's held liable, let's say. Who do you throw in jail? Who do you punish? There's no thing there. Okay, company, you have to pay X many dollars and maybe we'll break you apart. As a shareholder, I'm like, oof, that was a bad investment. So it's a way of limiting, corporate law limits liability. The other thing is it creates a perpetuity. They don't die. They just don't die. So I'm a community, I'm struggling, I'm fighting the corporation, and then we're in the courts, and this court, and that court, and then I die, and then maybe my comrade or my cousin takes up the struggle, and they continue, and they just change the CEO, and the corporation can fight this for as long as they have to. And the community will disappear and be forgotten, and the corporation will still exist. Hudson Bay Company was the imperial company that creates Canada. It's now a department store. It still exists. Now it sells whatever, blankets and whatever. So we need to sort of unpack the corporation from its legal insides is one. I think that's where I start thinking in terms of things. And then the tax laws is another sort of powerful way. There's all these ways that corporations allow individuals. In the end, it's people. It is people behind these things. To go back to our communal roots, we can't go back in time. We just cannot. It's physically impossible. However, and the past was also rife with violence and misery and death and all of that. I love vaccines. They're fantastic. Why would I want to go backwards in time, right? But I imagine it more differently in this sense, which is to imagine industrialization of food systems as this moment of sort of forced forgetting, of forgetting a tradition and forcing you on a different path of knowledge. So what I mean by this is that think of it more as recovering and going back to a tradition, and these traditions are alive. Traditions are alive. That's the point. They're dynamic. So getting off the industrial path and going back onto the path of relating to the land as a long-standing relationship, where the more you give the land, the more it gives you back. Where the knowledge that is privileged is, yes, we need science, and we need experts, and we need students, and we need the institutional knowledge that comes from study and research and experimentation. But let's start with experiential knowledge, the knowledge from practice, the knowledge that farmers, indigenous peoples, that workers have from work. We all learn by doing. That is part of being human. There are those traditions of knowledge that we can recover, get back onto those paths, find those communities that never lost it. So so I think of it less in terms of going back and more in terms of getting onto a different path. In terms of, thank you for the question about Article 11. As a legal question, you're right. There's so much in that article that there's so much more work to be done. It can be interpreted in a lot of fascinating and dynamic ways. So it's interesting. What I like is you're focusing on Article 11 as sort of the continuous improvement of living standards. How is that different than the right to development? I would say go for that, and development has a lot of baggage. And I have, again, close people they say right to development is far more interesting than right to food. Yeah, sure. But there's the right of development track. So I think, but development already has this long history. This is a concept that doesn't have a long history. So I would say, keep doing your work, keep thinking creatively. You answer it, basically. Like, you get to answer it, because I don't think that answer is there. That's the beauty of research.
Thank you, Michael. And that's the beauty of individual responsibility, which you were highlighting a lot during the talk as well.
Yeah.
Very important. Let's go for a couple other questions. You took a few extra minutes on your talk, Michael.
I did.
So we're going to take some more questions, if that's okay.
Very good moderator, yeah.
Right. And, my colleagues need to alert me with the time. Please, the lady here in the red jacket, and then we'll take one over there towards the back. And do you mind if we take three?
That's good, yeah.
And the third one all the way there in the back, please. Thank you. I'm sorry?
This is the last round.
Are these the last questions? Okay.
3 questions and then I think.
Great. Thank you, Eva.
Well, thank you, Mr. Fakhri, for your wonderful speech. I'm Nelleke Don. I'm the president of Slow Food Netherlands, which is part of the worldwide slow food movement. I would invite, actually a little commercial, I would invite all the young people to look up Slow Food Youth Network for the connection that you were thinking about, because they're organizing wonderful things to bring people together. Anyway, I had a couple of questions about the power of institutions, but I'm actually interested in what your next step is going to be, because you, as the reporter for the UN, what is your next step? Thank you.
Thank you. The young lady who was there in the back, please.
My name is Bibiana Kalejan, and I'm from the Embassy of Armenia. First of all, thank you very much for very interesting and thought-provoking lecture. So I would like to bring to your attention one situation, and I'm pretty sure that half of this room is not really aware of it. But there's an ongoing humanitarian crisis in South Caucasus, also involving the element of violation of the right to food. So it's been more than 3 months that Nagorno-Karabakh is in illegal blockade, and the people, like 120,000 people, are there in a blockade without food and without the basic necessities. And my question is very interrelated to the previous question. What is your role here as the UN rapporteur? And also 2 more questions. So has the international community the obligation to somehow prevent this kind of situation and to react to this kind of situation, and how can we enforce then the basic right to food for those people? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think those are the two questions, Michael.
Okay.
And they're very challenging, but
They
we
are
do need
indeed.
to start closing. So if
Indeed.
you could.
So I'll answer them in reverse order then. So thank you for the question from the representative from Armenia. So for everyone's purpose, this is a very important issue indeed. I've received reports about what's going on, and it's devastating from the reports that I've read. And so what I have done, and it's now public record, I can say, what happens is I often receive what are called formally allegations. And then what I do, part of my role, is I take those allegations and we keep them anonymous. We protect people's identities so that we protect their safety. And if we feel that they're warranted, we write a letter to the government that's in question. These are called communication letters. And what we do, this I'm procedurally broadly speaking, is we say, look, we can't verify this. I haven't gone to Azerbaijan and I haven't gone to the particular corridor. I haven't seen it. But we've received these very, very powerful allegations and the situation sounds very dire. Can you please speak to it? So we put it to the government to actually answer to things, and we frame it as a right to food. And I received allegations about this situation in Azerbaijan, and I've written a communication letter. So you can go, and I'm happy to direct you to, it's not the best database, but you can see the letter and the allegations, and you can see the responses. We copied the mission of Armenia in Geneva. But I think this is an issue that doesn't get covered enough in the media, so this is, I can't speak substantively. What I can say is basically what I've said in procedural terms, that it is important, and we've asked the government of Azerbaijan to speak to it. On my next steps, I mean, I'm not surprised that someone from the slow food movement has asked such a generous question, so thank you very much. I think that's quite appropriate. So I have 3 more years in my mandate. There's sort of the 2 fronts I'm working on. My next, I continue to focus on the food crisis. And what I'm doing is I focus a lot on international institutions to try and shape and influence and keep the conversation going. To be very specific, we're in a food crisis. Okay. I've said it enough times, and I just said, don't call it a crisis. Crisis is overused. What's happened is this, that before even there was the pandemic, governments around the world realized something's wrong with our food systems. And the Secretary General, because of the rise of hunger, had called for a food systems summit. And the summit happened in September 2021. And this was sort of the ideas, the language was, we must transform our food systems. Okay, everyone's like, okay, the status quo is not working, we have to change. Now, it's a huge debate. How do we change? Do we do green growth? Do we do this? Do we do, it was open. While that's happening, the food crisis happens, and so there's this, now we're in a moment where countries need to respond in the immediate term to the rising rates of hunger, malnutrition, and famine. Hunger is everywhere. Hunger is in The Hague, hunger is in the Netherlands, hunger is in Europe. It's not just the countries over there. Hunger is on the rise everywhere, and it's going to get worse. It's just a fact. What happened is the Food Systems Summit was awful. I was involved in the organizing. I saw this firsthand. They brought people from the World Economic Forum to run the show. And they actively fought us. We're like, why is human rights not on the agenda? This is a UN summit called by the Secretary General. They refused to put human rights. We finally pushed and pushed and pushed. Social movements were pushing incredibly hard. They got human rights on the agenda, and they wanted to make it as meaningless as possible. You know what was not on the agenda also? The food crisis. We were organizing in the midst of the pandemic, and they didn't want to talk about the crisis. It was a corporate agenda. It was a waste of time and money. But part of the problem is now we have 2 separate agendas. Transform your food system, brought to you by the World Economic Forum, and deal with the food crisis. And my argument is the way you respond to the food crisis is actually how you're transforming your food system. So let us connect those thoughts and connect those ideas. The second, that's one dynamic. The other dynamic is No matter what you do in your country, you can have the best food plan to transform your food system, but without international cooperation, you're doomed to fail. Policymakers know this. I've said it to them, and they've all, or privately, like, oh, that's great you said that. This is the first food crisis we've had where there's no international coordinated response. 2006, 2007, it led to change. In the 90s, they used the right to food. There's always been some response, even if just performative. There has been no international coordinated response to the current food crisis. There was an attempt to the Committee on World Food Security, and it was blocked, ironically, by the United States and Russia. They don't get along in Ukraine, but boy, did they not like the right to food, and they don't like playing well with others. Things changed after the war in Ukraine. So this year is a very important year to try, there's momentum, movements and governments and there's a new alliances happening. What I love about food is it forces a new type of politics and new people getting along and new relationships that countries that aren't comfortable working together are working together. And I'll end here. There's the General Assembly, there's the Committee on World Food Security. In this next year, it's sort of, this is the moment where things are looking better. Right to food is finally on the agenda. So for 2 years when I say me, it's everyone behind the right to food. I'm one actor amongst many. But finally, we don't have to argue that the right to food is relevant. It's now recognized, it's everywhere. The right to food is finally everywhere after 2 years of fighting. Now we're at the moment of, so what? It's the moment of action. So for those of you that sort of have influence, or you have members of parliament, or you're in local government, hypothetically, this is the time to push your national governments to say, what's your position on the Committee on World Food Security? We're all going to be in Rome in October. We're going to set the agenda for the Committee on World Food Security for the next 4 years. We're going to push for international coordination. Ask your members of parliament, ask your politicians, ask your policymakers, what's your position? Why are we not actively encouraging international cooperation? And you'd be surprised how politicians respond to people who vote. Let's end there.
Thank you, Michael. Well, I told you we were in for a treat. Let's thank Michael for this wonderful talk. And I welcome Professor Leinzat to say a few words of parting. Thank you, Lisbeth.
Well, I think I speak on behalf of all of you to thank Professor Fakhri for your interesting talk, but also for your challenging comments. It is exactly what we had hoped for, food for thought. So thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us today and for responding to the questions. For me, there is little else to say other than that I need to thank the team who have worked with Professor Fakhri in organizing this annual lecture. Jeff Gordon is unfortunately not with us today due to ill health, but thank you, Leon, for stepping into his role in part. Thank you to Eva, to Annelies, to all of the team who have worked together to prepare this meeting. I'm sure I've forgotten a number of people, but I will thank them later on. For us now, I think perhaps the ideal moment to share our first impressions, to continue discussions with a drink and undoubtedly something to eat as well. So may I invite you to the reception, and may I already invite you to the next annual lecture next year. Thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you, Leon.
That was fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful.